Hi there, folks, and welcome to this sort of introductory video to this little series I'm putting together called Gaming Through History. And the title says it all, really. It's a video series very much put together for my own interest, where I'm looking to bring together and sort of draw a line under two, uh, very interesting parts of my life, being my passion for history and my passion for gaming. And to do so, just to give everything a bit of context, I thought I'd put together this little introductory video to tell you a little bit more about myself, um, what brings me to this series, and what to expect. So starting off, I suppose, with history. Um, my passion for history, if you like, started very young when my parents and my sister, we'd often go to castles on weekends. It was one of our sort of regular little day trips out. My mum would put together wonderful picnics, real feasts, and we'd just have the most wonderful times, very happy memories when I was a kid, kind of exploring castles. And I was always drawn to what came to be known in my family as wrecks. So castles that had been beaten up through history, castles that really wore their history. And there were a number close to where I grew up. On the left, you've got Chepstow Castle, and on the right, you've got Goodrich, both located in the sort of border areas of England and Wales, a very prominent area for castle building, as successive English and Welsh landowners look to protect their land and protect their borders against the other. Um, and yeah, I mean, this was when I was very young, a kid, and that just always gave me an interest in history, and I suppose military history, because I was drawn to these wrecks. I was drawn to the battles, to the stories that had led to these beautiful places in left in picturesque ruin. Always a bit controversial in my family. My sister preferred to go to more sort of stately home castles. So there was always a bit of friction as to whether we'd be going to a wreck or a nice stately home where you could admire the furniture and the period setting, perhaps. But I was always drawn to the wrecks, always drawn to the ruins. Um, and obviously, that translated for an interest in the medieval period generally, an interest in history generally. Throughout school, I continued to be interested in history until I sort of got to a point later in my school career where I was kind of frustrated, I suppose, with the emphasis on British history. And I suppose that's to be expected in any country, that when you study history, you study the history of your nation. But I was always curious about what was going on in the rest of the world. And the curriculum in the United Kingdom didn't really allow for that. So I kind of drifted away from history for a number of years. Um, Ended up studying languages at university, which kind of made sense, right? Because I was interested in exploring other cultures, interested in exploring other histories, and I kind of wanted to do that through languages. And I did travel a great deal, and it was great to be able to explore different countries, explore different histories, and kind of yeah, explore the different routes that peoples and nations have taken over the eras. Always something that brought me back to history would be travel and would be language. And I eventually actually started a PhD, which was going to be in a historical subject. I was looking particularly at the sort of decolonial experience, if you like, the post-colonial experience in South America. So in the sort of early to mid, focusing on the sort of early to mid 1800s, particularly in Colombia, a country I'd lived in. And kind of asked, my particular focus was asking the question about how education was being used, because I also had spent time in teaching, and I was interested in terms of how these early nations that grew out of the retreat of the Spanish Empire, used education to promote nationalism, to promote some kind of new identity. And in the case of the area I was looking at, it's very interesting to explore because you do have Gran Colombia, which some of you might be familiar with, a large Spanish-speaking superstate, if you will, that would today cover most of modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, parts of Ecuador down to Peru. But that was a nation among many in that post-colonial period that didn't last particularly long and ultimately collapsed. So that was the basis of my PhD. How did these new nations look to sort of promote themselves to their populaces, and ultimately what went wrong? I say started because I didn't finish. I suppose the real world perhaps got in the way. I was actually doing it on a part-time basis. So a part-time PhD is going to take a long time, and I don't think I was prepared for that kind of long-term investment, particularly when academia, particularly in history, perhaps wouldn't mean that I come out of the process with a very stable looking future. And at that point, I was looking to sort of settle down with my partner. So the prospect of perhaps buying a house, starting a family, etc., didn't look so rosy. Pursuing sort of an academic career. Add to that, to be honest, I had struggled to get the project off the ground. I was struggling with momentum, and doing a PhD part-time, I was struggling to balance research and the job I had at the time. Kind of felt I was doing two things badly rather than anything particularly well. And I just couldn't invest the time. So I ended up not completing the PhD and withdrawing after a few years. So that was a disappointment. But in my private life, I went away and I did settle down. And now myself and my partner, we have a wonderful little fella who's approaching 3 years old, and another one on the way who, by the time this video is out there, may well be with us. So I suppose ultimately something that I'll reflect on. I would love to deep dive into these historical subjects and to make it my life's work, but hard to do when there's so much else that needs doing and so much else that needs paying for. So who knows? I may revisit it. But in that respect, this series is almost about bringing together some of my historical passions and drawing a line underneath them, because with the busyness of family life, pursuing my interests in historical sort of academia is something I'm not going to have so much time to do. And that kind of brings me also to the second sort of aspect of this series, which is the gaming aspect. And I suppose my interest for gaming doesn't really run parallel to that of history. I didn't grow up in a particularly techie family. We weren't trailblazers, if you like, in sort of home entertainment technology. So I'm sure I was quite late to the sort of gaming space. I did have consoles growing up where I'd play, sports games, FIFA, that sort of thing, Brian Lara cricket. And never really liked the sort of first person games, however. To be honest, I mean, call me a coward, but I just found it a bit scary. I didn't like being shot at. Why would I like to be shot at? So, when friends and I would gather together and play, GTA evenings or GoldenEye, I tended to go a different track. My friends would often wind me up for playing GTA rather sedately. I'd like to drive around the cities, respecting the traffic rules and just enjoying life in the city. getting a feel for the vibe, visiting the bars and cafes without necessarily shooting up the neighborhood sort of thing. And yeah, GoldenEye multiplayer was something we did used to play, and that was nightmarish. I was absolutely terrible at it. Um, and eventually we did get a home PC, and that's where I suppose I started to find my particular gaming niche. I suppose I had a social niche, if you like, where I'd play these multiplayer games somewhat begrudgingly and very poorly. Um, but I found a home in strategy gaming. Probably the first gaming series that I really got into was Championship Manager, which sits on the left, which some of you may be familiar with. A lot of you will maybe be more familiar with Football Manager, which comes from the same sort of stable, but Championship Manager was the sort of football management game that dominated the market, some time ago before it evolved into Football Manager. And Lordy, was it addictive. I mean, this took me through much of my teenage years, well into university, up to the present day. I don't play so much these days, but it was one of those games that absolutely sucked you in. If your team was playing badly, you didn't want to go to bed if your team was in bad form. But if your team was playing very well, you didn't want to go to bed if your team was on form, and you had a run to the Champions League final in the offing, perhaps. So it's definitely one of those games where you'd sit down for a couple of hours. Perhaps I was at uni, sit down for a couple of hours at the end of the day, and then before you knew it, you'd look out the window and it was daylight. It's like, right, okay, so I've just played through the night there, have I? That's 6 or 7 hours that I'll never get back. So an incredible game, and that kind of consolidated, I suppose, my interest in strategy games and my interest in sort of single player PC gaming, and that's more or less where I've lived ever since. Now, having got that, interest in strategy games, I suppose in my sort of teenage years, I don't know what age I was, but one Christmas or birthday, I asked for Age of Empires. Don't know what edition it was. I don't know how old I was, but as I say, my parents weren't particularly techy, and my mum must have gone into some game shop and said, right, my son would like this game. What's it all about? And yeah, like I say, I don't know how old I was, but when my Christmas or birthday, whenever it was, came around, it was Command and Conquer. I received Command and Conquer Red Alert. And my mum explained to me that she must have spoken to somebody in the store who'd said, "Ooh, bit of a tough one that for someone of that age." I must have been young. Must have been young. I mean, I don't know how young, but bit of a tough one that for one so young. So I ended up playing Command and Conquer Red Alert. And I suppose that was the first time that I'd moved, Championship Manager, throughout my childhood. But in Command and Conquer was the first time I'd moved to sort of, military strategy, RTS, RTT stuff. And I loved it. Yeah, I mean, it's such an enjoyable game. It's great to see all the remasters out at the moment that, I'm having a deep dive into, which I may well explore in some other series, but out of curiosity. But yeah, just a really enjoyable game. And that got me into the sort of RTS, RTT strategy, military strategy genre. And I do often wonder, how my life might have been different if I had received uh, Age of Empires rather than Command and Conquer. Who knows? It's the butterfly effect, isn't it? You change one thing in someone's life, you change one thing in the world, and everything that comes subsequently will change. So who might I have been? Had I have been an Age of Empires player rather than a Command and Conquer player in those young formative years? I'll obviously never know, but here we are. Command and Conquer it was, and Yeah, greatly enjoyed it. But obviously, if you are a historian, Command and Conquer is a curious beast. Red Alert has its historical characters, Stalin, Hitler, even. Uh, the basic, the whole premise of Red Alert being a sort of alt history Europe where the Nazi Party never rose to power in Central Europe. I mean, it's an interesting premise. It doesn't take itself at all seriously, and the deeper you get into the Command and Conquer series, the wackier it gets. But there was a historical bent. But of course, like many others, I found a home in Rome Total War. I mean, this was the coming together of my worlds, and in so many ways, the perfect game because it combined that sort of overarching strategic gameplay that I might have enjoyed in sort of an Age of Empires styly game, uh, or other games that I was playing, like Civilization and things like that. But it combined the real-time battles of Command and Conquer. And more than that, it did it in a legitimate historical setting, which, obviously interested me from that sort of like faux academic standpoint. It was beautiful and it was incredibly well put together and it was very immersive. Looking back on it, you can see all the, really poor efforts and sort of historicity that exist in the game. But certainly at the time, it was transformational. And I think, that's the game that made me a gamer. Prior to this, yes, I'd dabble with Championship Manager. Yes, I'd, play the odd, you know, FIFA binge with friends and all the rest of it. But from then it was the Total War series that I was into. Um, and I've, bought and played pretty much every game in the Total War series since then. So it was a perfect evolution for me, really. And one, like I say, that I've followed ever since. I've drifted in and out of Total War, don't get me wrong, um, largely because of the hardware. I'm not one to have a full-on gaming rig or sort of update my computer regularly. So there were times when my computer, whatever I had at the time, simply wasn't up to the games that Creative Assembly was putting out. So I've drifted and floated, but I've pretty much played um, the vast majority of Total War titles, and I am one of the old school historical fans. That's very much where I lived. I've dabbled with the Empire games as well, out of a sense of loyalty and sort of curiosity to Creative Assembly, but it is the historical series that has got me. And that again brings me to now, where I'm older and the time I have for gaming is becoming limited. So again, I thought I'd bring my gaming career, if you like, to a bit of a close by reviewing the games and their histories and the histories in the games, if you like, through this series. And, just to give that a bit of another kind of faux academic sort of framing, I think, games as a medium are very important, especially for younger people. So this is the kind of series that my very young kids right now may well reflect on in later years to see a little bit of what their old man talked about and thought about when he was younger. But certainly when we come to our historical understanding, today you're as likely to watch a film, a mini series, play a game set in a historical period, and that can really influence our understanding and our sort of overall comprehension of what that period was like. How it was experienced, how events panned out, and of course, it's very controversial currently with the kind of reframing of certain histories, based on different agendas, different interpretations of historical sources. Um, and we might talk about it in film and other forms of media, but we can also talk about it in gaming. And this is a little sort of feedback loop that I think is it comes to the core of what I'm trying to do in this series, but also is one to sort of reflect on in terms of how historical games sort of define themselves. And I suppose you'd start, so starting off at the top there, sort of concept and purchase. This this little feedback loop, I think, works as much as in much in terms of game design as it does in terms of gamer experience. As much for the person making the game as much for the person consuming the game. And we start off with that, concept versus purchase. Like, why are you making a game set in the medieval period? Why are you buying a game set in the medieval period? And it's probably because you have an affinity or an interest with that time period. Why have you chosen, again, I'm using the medieval period as an example, why are you choosing the medieval period for this experience? Why wouldn't you push it back a few hundred years? At that initial stage, it's a lot to do with historical understanding. You're coming into it with an affinity and a certain level of understanding of what it would mean to create a game set in that period. Or from the consumer standpoint, you're buying the game because you're interested in the period and you have an idea of what you'd like to see and experience in that game. That then, I suppose, kind of changes with the designing of the game. So as a game developer, you've got the idea, perhaps it's based purely on your own, interests and passions. On the other hand, perhaps you've employed a handful of experts to help you design mechanics, to help you create themes and concepts to be present throughout a game set in the medieval period. So, there's different levels of this historical understanding that then move from the concept stage to that design stage. And similarly, you have your preconceptions as a game consumer, but then, you go into actually playing a game and you start to think about, well, how are these, how is the gameplay evolving? How are these mechanics? How are my thoughts and feelings about the medieval period actually going to exist in a gamified world? And in a way, am I going to believe them? Is it going to feel legitimate? Is this in any way faithfully portraying the medieval period? And that again is down to our own understanding of the genre, own understanding of the period, and for the game designer also, what is the genre of the game? How are you going to represent that, and how are you going to make it stand out against, a game set in any other historical or a historical period? And then that then relates to the gameplay and the overall experience, because you've got an idea. Let's say you're a game designer, you've got an idea of what it would be to, what you would need to put in a medieval game. You've tried to create a coherent design and implement it, but then it's got to be fun. It's got to be fun. So what makes it to the final edit? What mechanics do end up in your historical game? Have you had to bin a load because they just simply didn't work? They were too complicated, or they just weren't fun. So by the time we actually get to the gameplay, either the gameplay, developed by the game designer or that experienced by the player, our sort of historical understanding has gone through a bit of a beating. We might have come into this experience, with quite a well-developed and deep understanding of again, as an example, of medieval period, for example, but through experiencing the game, or by watching the movie, or by reading the book, we start to get a very different understanding of medieval history, one that is gamified, and one that is presented to us in an experience that is there to be sort of enjoyed and to go back and play again, which of course is very ahistorical, where we have more or less only one playthrough. And then I would call that a feedback loop, because then that obviously lends itself to, that obviously influences our historical understanding. You come out of that experience with perhaps a very different understanding of the medieval period, let's say. And it could be for bad or it could be for worse. Maybe we come out with a totally incorrect, totally ahistorical, maybe we've had a fun time, but maybe ultimately our understanding of the historical period has been really altered to the detriment. And the same for the game designer. Have you created a game, that works? And, if you're going to do it again, would you build off the top of that? Would you compound mistakes in terms of how you represent the period, or would you take a very different tack? So all of this leads to a kind of an evolution of historical understanding through the game, which, as I say, can be heavily to the detriment, because we are looking at gamified experiences, and how are you going to represent, if you're doing a game in the medieval period, how are you going to represent the Black Death? How are you going to give any gamer a meaningful experience where millions upon millions of people died a pretty gruesome, ugly death? Obviously there's the pretty aspects and the not so pretty aspects of history, but how are these major world events going to translate to game mechanics, and how in turn does that mean that when we come out of the game we have a different, and as I say, quite probably erroneous interpretation of what that was. So in a way, this is what I'm looking to explore. I'm not over egging it in terms of the academia and the sort of philosophical reviews, but I'm going to be looking at games, and I'm going to be looking at themes. I'm going to keep it pretty simple, just 3 themes per period, but that's what I'm looking to get at. If you're looking at a game in this period, what are the themes that one would expect to see? How well are they represented in game, and how does that play out against our own history? So, like I say, it's almost a way of reconciling my passions for history, research, and analysis in the gaming world. And the 2 series we're looking at are Creative Assembly's Total War series, which is to be expected. As I say, it's one of my favorite gaming series, and in a way the game series that made me into a gamer. And alongside that, to provide a sort of compare and contrast process, I'm going to be looking at the Paradox historical series. Now, I came to the Paradox historical series a lot later in life. And I think that's probably a fairly standard evolution. Paradox games are a lot more complicated than Total War games. I think my younger self would have struggled. Perhaps the man in the shop talking about Age of Empires had a point. But then again, perhaps if I'd had Age of Empires, maybe that would have been a difference. If I'd have had an interest in Age of Empires as a kid, I would have moved more to Paradox. Don't know how that process plays out. But nonetheless, Paradox titles, I suppose I was always curious about, but I felt satisfied, if you like, by Creative Assembly and Total War. I felt that my historical war gamey itch was being scratched. But certainly, fans of Total War will know that they've kind of gone astray in recent years. And if you are a gamer that's interested in historically themed games, Paradox is a sort of a safe place to move to, as Creative Assembly went in different, more fantastical directions. So for the last few years, I've played a lot more Paradox games than I have Total War games. And although I can't claim to be at all good at them, I mean, some of the Paradox titles I really struggle with. They are chalk and cheese in terms of depth, both for beautiful and maddening reasons. But nonetheless, they do cover similar periods, and they do look to represent history in very different ways. And so it's an interesting, they're interesting to put alongside each other in a series that looks to do this sort of analysis. So that's what I've looked to do. And I suppose at the outset, here are some sort of, observations you might reflect on as the series goes on. So Total War says it all. Conflict focus. What does that mean? Well, immersive, direct gameplay. You are on the battle map, you are leading the armies, you are put in, quite an active position within the game. That does lead to a very simple gameplay loop. And, I think this is probably the thing that Total War struggles with, particularly when it comes to its historical fidelity and historicity. Because most Total War games, well, all Total War games really fall into this gameplay loop of expanding your economy in a fairly simplistic way to expand your army, to expand your territory. The aim of pretty much all Total War games is to simply conquer the map, to create a bigger empire. There isn't much nuance really to the overall campaign experience, and it's something I definitely think that Total War has struggled with because it's failed really to evolve that concept. And like I say, that does tend to lead to games being pretty light on historical themes with an emphasis on melee combat. So light on historical themes because just how complex can we get? You need to build your economy, but we're not going to make this an economic sim. You need to expand your army, but you need to get it in the field. So, we're not going into the hardcore of the minerals required to create gunpowder, etc. We just want to get the armies in the field so you can fight the battles. So light on historical themes. And then the emphasis on melee combat. I mean, this is where Total War has also had a bit of an issue that we'll touch on through the series. Failing to get into the modern period. Again, if you create a Total War game series, you expect to get to World War II, one would say, to wars of World War One, World War Two, to really, periods of history defined by Total War. But issues with designing and implementing firearms, it kind of led to Creative Assembly retreating from that whole period. And that does sort of lead into that final thing, awkward historical fits. I mean, not all historical periods are about total war. Most historical, all historical periods, have, very important social, economic, just other factors that should be put to the fore in a game that genuinely looks to recreate a historical period. But Total War, because it's kind of tied by this rather fixed, simplistic gameplay loop of expansion, does lend it to sort of landing in rather awkward historical places. And that's something that we'll explore as the series goes on. Moving over to the Paradox then, very much more in the grand strategy mold, the sort of God perspective where as the player you aren't playing a character, you're sort of omnipotent, aren't you? You're kind of you gotta I mean there are some games, again, you look at Crusader Kings 2, you do play, well, Crusader Kings series, you play a character. But in most of the other Paradox games, you've got to piece in all the pies. You're looking at the economy, you're looking at social elements. You are commanding armies. You're not on the field of battle. You don't see the field of battle necessarily, but you're there, sort of overseeing everything without being a defined character. And that means that we do have far broader themes and far broader mechanics. It's trying to bring in all aspects of the social, the economic, the cultural, the military, and that in turn lends itself to strong historical theming, because if you're going to bring in all of those mechanics, all of those interplaying factors, you're going to need to give them some historical relevance. You're going to need to contextualize them. And so you can already see that the nature of the game design is influencing how those mechanics have to be created. And there's kind of an emphasis on historical fidelity, at least within the Paradox series, that Creative Assembly is kind of written out of its own process. I mean, this is an interesting one because for Paradox, the aim of the game is a curious one. You know, it's an interesting kind of debating point. In Creative Assembly's case, Total War's case, the aim of the game is conquest, and they kind of don't play with that. Whereas for Paradox, you know, there is so many interrelating factors. You know, what is the aim of the game? And that differs from game, and to a certain extent, that itself is themed by the period. I mean, Paradox do a wonderful job of creating that, you know, sort of, yeah, that thematic approach throughout their games. And you know, they do kind of rather awkwardly tack on a scoring process so that survival, getting to the end of the period, is you know, is an objective in itself. You know, simply being at the end of the game, and that's kind of borne out. You know, when you see on Steam the number, you know, the percentage of players that have actually completed a game from beginning to end, for example, being absolutely minimal. I mean, many players just use it as a short-term sandbox, but to actually complete the game, to complete the historical period, is an achievement in itself. But the scoring, you know, you kind of end up with a rather, sometimes it feels rather a perfunctory, almost, you know, sort of hard to interpret score. You know, it's something that that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that kind of goes to that question of, when does history end? You know, Paradox and Creative Assembly, they both create these sort of artificial blocks of history that we can enjoy, but they do have to come to an end. You know, when do you draw the line? And Paradox, in creating these sort of scores, kind of create an end point, and then give you a little perfunctory to score course to say, well, you know, it's almost like saying to the player, well, look, history never ends. You know, you draw the line in the sand at some point, and you know, you end up with a fairly perfunctory answer as to who is winning and who is losing. Because if you fast forward another 5 years, it could be very different. So I think there's an awful lot of, you know, very interesting concepts that come out of Paradox's games. And then, you know, it kind of goes to that final point. Are they too complex, or are they not complex enough? Certainly my experience is that Paradox does try to really pile in the historical mechanics, does really look to pile in the historical themes. And, you know, you could argue that with some titles, it leads to a bit of a mess, particularly when you factor in also Paradox's corporate strategy of adding DLC and other sort of expansions to its games. They can become rather unwieldy games to get into. So, you know, that's a question too. You know, how far do you gamify history? Creative Assembly certainly looks to simplify things. Paradox looks to complicate things. And there's always going to be a balance to strike to create a product that is both, you know, enjoyable and relevant to the gamer who's gone into the experience looking for something that has genuine sort of historical fidelity. So finally, let's just have a look at the games we're going to look at. So I've put in, I think most of the games, the bold ones are what we're going to cover, because I've looked to include games that have that appear in both timelines, if you like. So Creative Assembly, we've got Rome 2, Medieval 2, Shogun 2, Empire and Napoleon, and they all kind of have Paradox parallels. You've got Imperator Rome, Crusader Kings 2, EU4, Sengoku, March of Eagles, so some smaller games, some bigger ones. Vicky 2 and Hoi 4 that I had to include because they're games that I really enjoy, but games that unfortunately don't have a Creative Assembly sort of comparator, so we'll look at those slightly differently. But this, I think it's interesting to look at this because it does highlight again how game design influences how history is being portrayed. Because Creative Assembly, you can see there's a real emphasis on the kind of early medieval and sort of ancient period, and that is large, and that is to a great extent because of the difficulties that Creative Assembly had in creating Total War games in the modern period. For me, Napoleon Total War is a really great game and would have been a great launch pad for games set, you know, in the later 1800s and into the early 1900s, First World War, Second World War even. But things seemingly did go wrong. Empire certainly was a buggy mess, particularly on the battlefield. And since then, Creative Assembly has defaulted to melee combat, primarily of the ancient world, with Troy and Pharaoh, and even with its fantasy genre, it's sort of a fantasy medieval period with Warhammer. So game design and sort of historical fidelity certainly has influenced how Creative Assembly have evolved their historical games. And I suppose a lack of emphasis on combat, perhaps, and not having to portray those mechanics is going to help Paradox flesh out its historical roster with more modern titles, going into the sort of end of the Second World War period with Hoi 4. Although, Hoi 4 and its emphasis on World War II is a very different game to Victoria 2, with its emphasis on the Victorian period. The waves of colonialism, the frictions over industrialization and resources, etc. So again, themes, mechanics, gameplay, design imperatives, all playing into how the history that we enjoy is presented to us, and how the way in which we enjoy history in turn influences how we understand it. And that's what I'm looking to explore in this series, guys. So thanks for tuning in. If you're going to be following the series, it's going to be very much like this, just talking over a basic PowerPoint. So if you want to listen to it as a bit of a podcast, that's great. I have quite a soporific voice, I understand. My wife often asks me to tell her a little story so she can go to sleep. So even if you want to listen to it as a bit of a sleep story, entirely up to you. But thanks for tuning in, and hope to see you in the other videos. Bye for now.